Namaskar to one and all. Welcome to this Mahabharata conversation on Indic Academy. Today, my host is Jijit Ravi, and he's quite well known. In the past, he was a scientist at ISRO, and he's currently an IT professional. But more importantly, he's well known as a person who's done a lot of studies in the Indic civilizational space, and in particular on Mahabharata. And it's an honor to have Jijit on this conversation. Welcome, Jijit. Namaste.
Yeah, namaste.
And my name is Shiv Kumar, and I write on Mahabharata on Indic Today. I hope a lot of you are reading that. And today we will discuss about Mahabharata. And it is quite, it is unlikely that anybody in India has not heard of Mahabharata. And it has fascinated different people in different ways over many millennia. And, some of us may be writing, but we are part of this large Indic civilization where different people are enthused about Mahabharata in different ways. So, Jijit, I would like to begin the conversation by requesting you to narrate your own beginnings of the study of Mahabharata, which is quite deep, and I've seen it on your website. And what fascinated you? What are those elements of Mahabharata that struck you? And of course, they are of importance to the rest of the country as well, because of the depth of studies that you have done. So I would like to hear that from you.
Yeah, thanks, Shigma, for the introduction. And yeah, as I said, I have started reading Mahabharata somewhere around 10-15 years. But initially my interest was in the painting of the characters. So I have some artistic skills. So I start painting or sketching the image of Krishna or the Pandavas. So that is one of the interest I had. And there was not much in our school syllabus about Mahabharata, Ramayana except the name. But what has shifted me into a different track was most possibly the Amar Chitragatha series of Pai. So he has saved me. I would say that he has just
Absolutely.
taken me out of the normal schooling and exposed to this the entire folk this lore and of the itihasas. So I have, with great interest, I was reading all the Amar Chitragatha series from start to beginning, and same that he has started Ramayana series, and I have read it. It was actually one of my cousins' collection. I started reading, who is elder to me, but I was completely into reading that, even reducing the time I spent for playing with other children. So that was the starting point, and then it was like a mix of both, like painting of it, and then I started seeing a map of like Digvijayas of the Pandavas. So there was a map in the Amar Chitragatha, and this is also started my entire academic career in doing the geographical analysis research in Mahabharata. I myself created maps. So some of the two maps.
The most fascinating part of your website are those maps, actually, which I've used a lot in my own narration of stories to people.
Yeah, yes. So 2004 I have created, and then 2008 I have created two maps. And my knowledge I have gone beyond that, but these two maps, because become like it gone to many, almost I have traced around 522 websites hosting the same maps, including Wikipedia and my own site Ancient Voice. Around 522 sites on Samskriti. They are actually hosting this map I have created in 2004 and 2008. So that way, and then slowly I started going deeper. Mahabharata, Amar Chitta gave me a base. Then I started reading the abridged versions in Malayalam, and then finally in my plus two, that is at that time it was called pre-degree. I was first seen the entire Mahabharata. Then I understand that there is a volume of it, like around 15 to 20 volumes of Mahabharata English translation. I have first read it. It was by M.N. Dutt. That volumes were there preserved in the college library. So there also I have, once I started this reading this, I spent less time with my friends. Most of the time as I was completely sleeping on this Mahabharata. Like that I would say. And then again, because I was also having great interest in science. So this is another area where, so it's like a dual interest. One is in Mahabharata and Itihasa, that is into the past, and another is the future. So as a career wise, because Mahabharata doesn't gives me any particular career. So career wise, I was interested in going into space technologies. So becoming a scientist was one of my interests, and I always tell to my parents that I will be in ISRO. I want to be there. I want to be in NASA and all those things. So finally, the career took me there. I got through some interview when I was working in IT. Like you, I was actually working in IT from 2000 onwards, year 2000 onwards. So after 1.5 years, I was got an interview into ISRO, and then they have taken my IT expertise. Basically, I was creating software for
but you're also in the space of Mahabharata. While you're interested in space technology, you're also interested in the space of Mahabharata.
Yeah, it's like one eye looking at the past, another into the future.
Okay. So, in particular, I'm very interested to know what struck you, because in the end, everybody begins the journey, but you have taken your journey into a great depths, not just in Mahabharata, but in other areas also, but in particular on Mahabharata. So I want to understand what struck you and what were those sparks in you that took you very deep into that.
Maybe because people can read Mahabharata in a different mindset. So many of the people read it like basically from the religious point of view, that it is this is a granth, it's a sacred text. That is one point of view. So I definitely have, because I'm an ardent devotee of Krishna, so I have that traditional point of view also. But I have some other multiple dimensions of looking at Mahabharata from the point of view of art. And because I have the scientific as a mindset of a scientist, so that is the reason why I'm going a little bit deeper. So when I look at it, you look at it in three ways. One is the devotional way, and another is as art. So Vyasa's descriptions, now that is like pure art actually, if you look at it. Second, third way is maybe I think that is got popular, and many people think me in that way, is that I look at it from the point of view of whether it is possible, this is possible or not. That kind of thought process. And again, as I said, like when I was in ISRO, again I was not pushed, but actually I'm again inducted into Mahabharata, because there I saw the research papers on Saraswati River. Because ISRO was one of the primary organization which was completely studied the Saraswati River, that entire basin, and conclusively proved that this is a river channel which can be identified with Saraswati. So any researcher of Mahabharata actually credit ISRO scientist for the proper analysis of Saraswati River. So I carry that legacy also. So again, I'm in the area of space. Suddenly, I'm again pushed back into study of Mahabharata. After reading that journals, again I switched because 2004 to 2006, like 2001 to 2006, I was in ISRO. Between that 2004 and 6, again I started spending my studies on Mahabharata and the Wikipedia. I contributed around 150 articles. Everything happened when I was working in ISRO. Whatever spare time I have after working for the launch vehicle, that is a GSLV team. I was in the GSLV cryogenic team. So whatever time after that, I spent in creating articles in Wikipedia on the various kingdoms in Mahabharata, etc. So I look at it as a point of a scientist with a little more deep depth into it, whether this is possible. And when I say one person is moving from another place to another, like Arjuna is moving from one place to another. I just look at it from the point of view of a traveler, and whether it is really possible or not, that I'll analyze. So it started from a point of view of an analyst. I started looking at Mahabharata. So that is the third dimension.
I can see that, there is a sense of voyage on your website too. I can see how your own, professional orientation has also kind of come into your Mahabharata studies. But interestingly, my own journey is very, very different. I came into the civilizational angle of Mahabharata much later. But for me, if you have read any of my articles on India Today, the greatest fascination is the metaphoric dimension of Mahabharata.
Okay.
For me, the very first shloka, Narayanam Namaskrityam Naranchaiva Narottamam, that is an inspiration. Along with it, the Ganapati and Vyasa conversation, that story itself is a fascinating metaphor for me, and I've written often about that. It captures the very creative process of formation of an epic. The amount of emphasis laid on the conceiver and the emphasis laid on the receiver, and what is the engagement between the two. That is the fascination for me, and I began my journey with getting enthused by the bits and pieces of stories. At another time, the Shuka, Vyasa's son Shuka, attaining mukti, and Vyasa being extremely Vyakula was a metaphor that I simply could not forget. I've lived with it for a long time. Between these extremes, I have the other metaphor of the Raibhya and Yavakrita story in Mahabharata. It's a small story. It comes as an upakhyana, and upakyanas are not main stories, and many people do not read them. But that one small story it captures the entire philosophy of Purushartha Sadhana in the utmost beautiful manner. So my interest started from there, but I've now reached where you have been doing for last 10 years, because thanks to people like you who've done a lot of research in the civilizational studies. But taking cue from what you said, and even on your website, you've written about the Bhishma Parva initial parts, really capturing the detail of Jambudvipa. It's fascinating to me, that look at the number of rivers being described over there. Shloka 14 onwards in the Bhishma Parva, chapter 9. It is Sharavatim Payoshnim cha Venam Bhimarathim api Kaverim Chulukam chapi Vanim Shatabalam api. So you have Sharavati there, and you have Payoshni, which I think is Payasvini there, and look at the Bharatavarsha description that comes from this. It's quite fascinating. It is unfortunate that many people do not know, which is there on your map. And even today, many people believe that the consciousness of Bharatavarsha or Bharata is a British contribution. But I think Mahabharata proves it beyond doubt that Bharatavarsha consciousness is a very, very long one, isn't it? And I would like to hear your views on that.
Yes. Yeah, actually, I have in one of the latest talks in Sangam, I have mentioned about the kind of topics or domains of interest that has been parked in the study of Mahabharata, and I'm really happy about that. And like, for example, Shivakumar, your kind of area of study that is very much useful. Like the picking up the highly philosophical and enriching sub narratives in Mahabharata, and that is one of the very kind of important study that has to be gone into the Mahabharata. Like, it has got, if you look at Mahabharata, it has got the main trunk, which is the Pandava the life history of the five Pandavas, but it has got so many branches. Like, for example, if Markandeya talks about one narrative, within that narrative, it again creates another sub branch.
Correct.
And the kind of when it goes to the leaf level, it's like 5 or 6 the branching has already happened, and there is a small story in that, and we will wonder why Vyasa has created that story there, but it has got a significance. And
absolutely,
you people like you and many, I also know many others like Indrajit, they have taking up that small stories and then expanding and exploring the philosophy. So that is really wonderful and remarkable. And so that Mahabharata is so vast that so many people can work together in that. So I have done a little bit of that unearthing of not so popular stories from Mahabharata, but my main focus, because of the vacuum in that area, is actually from the point of view of like maybe you rightly pointed out, like a traveler. Like I'm following the different heroes in Mahabharata, like Arjuna. So how many places he visited, and in which way he is traversing in that particular narrative, or Yudhishthira, or even very say Nakula Sahadeva. People say that there is not much talked about Nakula Sahadeva. I have huge information. I can write a novel about Sahadeva if you want.
Absolutely, fully agree.
That much information, the places he went, even his characteristics, those things are all clearly not. So rightly to answer the question directed at me, I have in many of all the conferences I have visited, I have talked about the Mahabharata consciousness, and it is like in the form of see, for example, one way of looking at it, because many people have narrated the expansion of the Mahabharata, like starting with Jaya, and then Bharata, and then finally Mahabharata. And within Mahabharata itself, a definition is Bharayat iti Mahabharata. Means it is heavy, and hence it is called Mahabharata. But if you look at deeply, there is another interpretation to it, is that the definition of Bharata is basically the places where the kings, the Bharata king and his descendants ruled. So if you look at that way, it is basically having a geographical connotation as well, which like people like a geographical point of view analysis like me can easily recognize. So Bharata is actually a certain amount of geography, and if you look at Bharata, basically it encompasses the regions like Vindhya and any region north of it. But Mahabharata, when it expands to the Mahabharata, actually the Kavi or the Vyasa and all the contributors to the Mahabharata is basically saying that it contains everything in what we call as Bharatavarsha, including Kerala, Pandya Chola, then Dasharna or Avanti, Kumti, or there is a kingdom called Anartha. Many people don't know. Like it is a neighborhood of Dwarka. In most of the part of Gujarat is now Anartha actually, whereas Dwarka is the island region in the west. So it encompasses everything: Kalinga, Angavanga, then.
In fact, Kalinga, all three parts of Kalinga, today's Orissa, are covered. Yeah. All two parts of Andhra Pradesh are covered.
Correct.
Dravida is only a smaller state,
right?
And Karnataka is covered as Karnataka and Mahishaka.
Correct.
And so it's all Kishkinda. Everything is separately mentioned.
Yeah. Yes. So there is no region in the like current Indian Union or in the Indian state which is not mentioned in Mahabharata. As you said, Kerala is mentioned. Like if you look at how it is spanned in Mahabharata, it is mentioned as Kerala. Then as there is a small kingdom called Mushika, which is in the northern part of Kerala, and then it is also mentioning Kollagiri.
Yes, yeah.
Very one single verse of Sahadeva's military expedition to the south, Kollagiri is mentioned, and that is it's also in Tamil literature. So it's a cross collaboration is possible. Karnataka is mentioned as three parts: Mahishaka and Karnataka, and then the northern side Kishkinda. So Mahishaka is Mysore. So many people. Andhra is mentioned as Andhra directly. It is mentioned. Southern part of it is Dravida, and then that is southern Andhra and northern Tamil Nadu. It is a Dravida Desha. A very specific, distinct Desha is mentioned like that. And then Chola is the Kaveri Delta, just like Kuru is Kuru Panjala is for is the on the Ganga River. The Chola is there for the as a kingdom, which is have the cradle on the Kaveri, and to the south Vaigai River, and in that Pandya is there. So entire South India is covered. Then Goa is Gomantaka, and then Maharashtra you have this Konkana Desha, that is to the west of it, and so many Rashtras. And this is something I need to research more, because Beli Rashtram, Navarashtram, then Pansurashtram. Pansurashtram means the Rashtra where the jackfruits are grown, but they're all mentioned as the part of Maharashtra.
Yeah.
Maybe some
correct. It's very interesting. The word Rashtra is so often used, not just in, of course, in Rigveda also it is used, but even in Mahabharata, the word Rashtra is quite commonly used.
Yeah.
And you have made one more very interesting point that, while describing the regions, the characteristics of those regions, not just geographical, but in terms of life is also, discussed. Where, what kind of people, maybe, you can call it as Vyasa's opinion or a bias. But there is a description of the nature of life in terms of where trade is, what is happening, what is the community characteristic in a certain way, and how Kurus thought about the other communities, or how they thought about even this life detail is also there in Mahabharata.
Right. The reason I am saying is because Maharashtra, current name for that state, that they have used that word Rashtra as a suffix of it. And if you look at in Mahabharata, you have so many princely Janapadas, with the suffix Rashtra. That is what I would say. I need to. This is something in area of research how it is happening. Like because the Navarashtra, Pansurashtra, Mahabali's Rashtra is mentioned on the banks of Narmada River actually. Anyway, that is another thing how it is associated with Kerala. It is another. I have talked about it. So that is what I feel that the geography is the reason why I'm doing it is because there is a vacuum here. There are not many people who are looking at the ancient Janapadas, and most of them restrict themselves to the 16 Janapadas, which is in the Yamuna, Ganga, Yamuna, and Saraswati river, that belt, that is Uttarapada. But that is just the last stage of the Mahabharata era that this 16 Janapada kind of concept has come out. But there are 300, I have counted once, 300 to between 300 and 400 Janapadas mentioned in Mahabharata, spanning every inch of Bharatavarsha. Even the Assam is mentioned as Lauhiti. And the mountainous regions are covered by the Aruna Parvata, like that. So Arunachal Pradesh, everything is mentioned like that. And Uttar Pradesh, definitely it is the heart of Mahabharata and Ramayana. The entire Uttar Pradesh, you have all the kingdoms starting from the west, Kuru, Panchala, then Kosala, and then this Mallara is there, and to the south there is Chedi and Kashi, and there is also a gap. This is something like if you read Mahabharata and Ramayana, you see some kind of a wall is there in between Kuru Rashtra and Ayodhya, Kosala Rashtra. And this is something mystery for me. And then I found that Naimisharanya is there in between. So there are no direct contact between the great two cultures like the Kurus and the Ayodhya, the Kosala Ikshvakus. But there are travel, like this is also one area of my interest. I corroborate Ramayana and Mahabharata. So in Mahabharata,
you make an interesting point. That's a very interesting point. Between Ayodhya and Kuru, if that is so, but Bhishma narrates a story where there's a king called Vitahavya, and Vitahavya is more in the Kuru Panchala region somewhere, a Haihaya king. but he goes on attacking, Haryashva, Pratardan, Devodasa, and Pratardana, who are fundamentally the Kashi kings. And, there is a big conflict that happens between the two.
Correct.
At some stage, there is, this engagement. But, at a later stage, that engagement seems to be lesser. That's a very fascinating thing, actually.
Yeah, let me clarify it. So what I'm saying is it's not like completely no interaction. I'm saying like if you read Ramayana, Rama is marrying from Videha Rajya, that is to the east of Kosala. And another his relationship is with Kashi. Kashi, he has got a friend. Pradardana comes as a friend of Rama in Ramayana. He is a king of Kashi. But there is nothing, no kind of interaction with any Kuru princess or anything. So that's what I'm basically saying, because the Naimisharanya is complete, but it is not completely interaction free, because in Ramayana, maybe it may surprise people that Hastinapura is mentioned. And it is mentioned in the travel of Bharata to Kekaya. So the reason I am saying is that anyway, we are all into the dharmic point of view, but there are some leftist historians who still think that these are all made up stories. So then you see kind of corroboration. Like a king, a prince from Ayodhya is traveling to the west, and he is passing through Hastinapur. And there is, if it's all made up stories, no, there should not be any
that consistency will not be there.
Yeah, there should not be any connection. But these are real geography.
And there is consistency in this. Even you mentioned Pratardana. Pratardana is there in Rigveda. And Pratardana is there in Pratardana is arguably an important sheet anchor, to organize all other kings in terms of hierarchy.
Yeah, so there is difference in the way the Pradardana is detailed in Rigveda. Rigveda, it is very, very highly detailed. But because maybe there are some kind of blending happened between Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the Rigvedic period. So the Pradardana is in Rigveda, he is considered as part of the Bharata lineage. And somehow it is adopted in Ramayana, he is adopted as somehow related to the Ikshvakus. That we can see. I mean, these are all
that's true.
Second is Yayati is mentioned as ancestor of Dasharatha, whereas it's clearly mentioned in Mahabharata and Rigveda, Yayati is that lineage is Chandravamsha. So there are some blending happened, and in Mahabharata itself, if you see that entire conflict, it's actually retelling. It's a retelling of Rigvedic conflict actually. Whatever happened in Kashi, that Devodasa and Pradardana, so that is slightly doing a retelling of it. And finally, their descendant end up at Hehaya, which is little bit far away from Kashi into the Narmada river. It's a Maheshmati, Maheshwar current city name. So these are the certain, this is some kind of a knot that has happened, like historical knot, which if you want to unwind, you need to do a little more detailed study about it.
Correct.
Some kind of blend that is happening. And it only adds to the reality, because if you have so much of events happened in such a long period in the past, definitely this kind of blending is what we expect naturally. So this all adding it up to the geographical integrity as well as the historical events that has happened. Some events has ensued. You are getting to know about it from a different perspective, from the Ramayana narrative, Rigveda narrative, and Mahabharata narrative. There will be expected deviations is what we are seeing actually. That's okay. That's perfectly fine.
Good. In fact, what we are coming to is that this is one aspect where research needs to go very deep.
Yes.
And to resolve, one is to establish consistency, and second is to resolve seeming contradictions. Some of them are not contradictions, but because it's fundamentally a metaphoric account, accounts are presented not as historical pieces, but for the purpose of metaphor and philosophy. But we will have to extract history from this. And I think that itself calls for a discipline of extraction. I think the process has only begun now, because last 70 years, it's been blocked. So I think the process has to begin now.
Yeah. So some of the naughty things, for example, and probably this is the one reason, because it requires a structured kind of an analysis is important.
Correct.
So when people just jump into it, because so many people have asked me, like passing after graduation, and all, so after some of my conferences are over, they come and say, I want to enter into this research. So the I tell, like, okay, you have to have a little patience, like maybe read the, like, for example, maybe initially you may be reading only the English translations, but then you have to finally go to the Sanskrit originals and read it. Then only you will get a full clarity. Otherwise, sometimes what happens, you just jump into some information.
That's true. That's
And this
true.
is normal. This is part of our generation. Like in Twitter battles, etc. You are saying, like, picking up some information and then spending some 5-10 hours on that. So that can happen. Just one example I'll give is the Pragjyotisha. Pragjyotisha is, if you look at all the later narrative, all the Aitihiyams, everything, you connect it with Assam, and it is almost to the eastern side of Bharatavarsha. But if you look at all the kind of events like mentioned related to Pragjyotisha, you see it's a kind of a city which is somewhere in the west. So why that happened? Like, for example, Krishna is actually fighting with the Pragjyotisha king, but Dwaraka is into the west. So that is one thing, and that starts that you need that riddle starts at that point. Now and so many other narratives are there. Like Arjuna is in his expedition, he is first going to Pragjyotisha, and suddenly he comes up somewhere in the Himachal Pradesh. So you see how he is going immediately to see. For example, Krishna's case, people will say he traveled in something like an airplane, like he is on Garuda. So maybe he traveled from Gujarat to Assam. Then people may be thinking it. So this is the areas in which people new researchers can get into this kind of trap. But then what about Arjuna? Arjuna is not traveling in an airplane. So that means all the narrative, if you look at Bhagavata narrative, Haivamsha narrative, Mahabharata narrative, where the Arjuna is traveled and Krishna has traveled to Pragjyotisha, everything indicated it is somewhere in the western side. So one identification I have gone after so much of meticulous research is somewhere in Himachal Pradesh, because Bhagadatta is mentioned as one of the person whom Arjuna has fought, and finally they made peace, and suddenly he is moving into Kulinda. Kulinda is in Himachal Pradesh. So it's in the wherever that mountains, Himalayan mountains, just join the Kurukshetra plain. That is where Kulinda is. Even Rama and Bharata moves. Bharata travel. Kulinda is located in that area. So if you look at all the connections, Pragjyotisha is in the somewhere in the north of Delhi, and towards westish. It is always westish. And finally, I looked at Ramayana. Here it clearly mentioned that it is in the west, because in that Sugriva's
description, Sugriva describes Jambudvipa very well.
For Vanaras in 4 direction, and Pragjyotisha come in the western side. So there is no confusion. So what happened is there was a lot of migrations happened, which is a migration that resulted into Sthala Puranas. So from the Himachal Pradesh, Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh regions, the Naga community, they have been migrated to the east. Finally, their current destination, current settlement area is in the northeastern states. So all the Nagaland, Mizoram, Tripura, this Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, all these, their roots are in somewhere into the Himachal, then Kashmir, and some people are from Orissa also, because Arjuna's wife, that is Chitrangada. Very clearly, the entire narratives say that he entered into Kalinga and then he goes to Manipura. So Manipura is considered as a city inside Kalinga. If you go and read in Mahabharata, original Sanskrit version, you can see. But where is Manipur? Manipur is in northeast. So then
I think names have shifted. I think migration would have taken names and would have shifted names. I think that
correct.
That possibility we cannot deny. I think that's an important.
Right. So that Chitrangada's descendants, they have some Naga connection, because Arjuna's 2 wives are Nagas actually. Ulupi, who is an Airavata Naga princess, And Chitrangada is not mentioned as Naga, but you can read the Mahabharata. There is very lot of connection between Ulupi and Chitrangada.
Ulupi and
They
Chitrangada.
met together. They live together.
Correct.
All this is happened. So they have the Manipura city is a like even now there is a port city in Kalinga. Archaeological excavated. The Manipura is excavated in Kalinga port as a port city. So that entire marine civilization, that entire people have migrated to the Manipur. And you see, if you look at the dance also, you can very clearly, it is similar to the Oriya dance. If you look at the Manipuri dance forms, all the culture, it's all very close ties with Odisha.
That's interesting. So that opens up an area of
Yeah,
civilizational studies and migration and other things.
Correct.
So let's shift our attention a little bit from the east to the west, which is quite fascinating in Mahabharata.
Yeah.
And the north and the northwest, the Bahlika region, the Gandhara region, where the Madra region, the northern Kashmir, and the Uttara Kuru regions. So it's a significant description of life in that area that comes in Mahabharata, which is kind of somewhat totally forgotten today. In we don't even talk about that. The culture of Uttara Kurus, what Pandu explains, Kunti, as a very open society, and so on and so forth. And you have done a lot of research, and you have also written about, the Gandhara and the Bahlika regions. And you've also written about certain conflicts. I cannot say that I fully agree with it, but it's quite fascinating. I want to understand, our viewers should know, what are those fundamental elements of life description over there, and what are those conflicts that you see there.
Yeah, so culturally, like if Mahabharata and Ramayana or Veda, all the four Vedas are just like a window to the same time period. Because I have seen many people like saying that Mahabharata era or Rigveda era like that. Even I have initially thought like that, but I have changed my mind. So everything is a window to the almost the same time period. Maybe Rigveda a little bit older. It has gone a little bit older. It is a window to a little more the older period. But Mahabharata, the window is overlapping with Rigvedic period. Ramayana window is overlapping with Mahabharata and Rigvedic windows. So there are overlaps. So that is first thing I need to say to the people who are listening. Second is culturally, it's a very diverse culture. The Kuru is like kind of a standard for everybody. Like, for example, if you look at Srikant Talagiri, who is a very close mentor and colleague for me, he has mentioned the entire Rigveda is actually a result of the sages associated with Kuru region. Bharatas
Kuru Panchalas.
Yeah, Bharata. Kuru means it's a little more specialized, but of Bharatas. So they are all Bharatas or the affiliates to the Bharata. If you look at all the Vishwamitra, Vasishta, everybody actually authored that entire Rigvedic corpus coming from that Bharata or kind of. And Bharata means both Kuru and Panchala are Bharatas. So that is the kind of, they are the trend setters basically. If you look at the USA, how they are setting the culture, how they are defining, that is a similar kind of a dominance or cultural dominance Kuru is having. And Panchalas are actually kind of means another version of the Kuru. They have their own priests and Purohitas and all. So these both two nations, Kuru and Panchala, they define the culture. And now you have to the west of it. They are actually descendant of the same the Kuru Panchalas. Their forefathers are same, but they have defined a kind of culture in which things are a little different. Kuru Panchala Chaturvarnya is very strictly followed. So that there are certain rules like the Brahmana Kshatriya. If you have a child born, he becomes a Suta. Like if it is a Brahmana woman and marrying a Kshatriya male, the son is born as Suta. And they have a certain kind of roles to play. Like driving chariots or becoming assistant to kings or singing in praise to the bard.
Sutta Puranika, Ugrashrava Sauti.
Yeah. all the Puranic accounts are there in their domain. They actually manage. They actually had maintain those Puranic accounts or the advice to king. All these things happen. Like, and similarly, there are certain rules, very strict rules, etc. That this is primarily followed in Kuru and Panchala region. And what happens is that to the west, what happened? They don't actually care this. Like the Gandharas, Kekayas, or Madra. So these three kingdoms primarily called Bahlika. Bahlika is separate kingdom also is there. Like for example, the Shantanu's brother, who Bahlika basically it also means went outside. Bahlika means going the person who has went outside. So there is a certain geography associated with the Bharatas, that is around ending at Saraswati in the west and Ganga in the east. That is the Bharata domain. So anybody going outside, they are Bahlika. So that is why the one of the brother goes outside of Saraswati to the west. He is called Bahlika. That is the meaning. But that Bahlika meaning is applied to anybody who has gone outside. So the outside means to the west. So again, the out of India theory is proved already because of this. And so the Gandharas, Kekayas, and Madras, they are all following this particular liberal Vedic culture, for example. So never in there nobody becomes a Suta there actually. So that is their tradition. So culturally there is some kind of liberalism that is happening in that western region, and other things are like this is completely revealed in the conversation between Shalya and Karna. Very interesting. I think you may be noting that because
it's
a very niche kind of
even in the conversation between Bhishma and Shalya, when Bhishma goes to seek Madri's hand.
Correct. So cultural differences very clearly. I have written an article in Wikipedia on that. I don't know whether it is damaged or not, but I have summarized in ancient voice. You maybe read that. So culturally, that Varna Vyavastha, that secondary children that they are not following, like Suta or Magadha, or Magadha is also one the Varna Sangara basically. So they are not following. So this is why the Karna got triggered, because he is the king of Anga. And the eastern side, I will talk about eastern side. So what happened, like sometimes these children who's actually born because of intermarriage of the Brahmana Kshatriyas, they move to the east. So the Magadha is a similar kind of intermarriage children. They go move to the east, and that is how Magadha, that Janapata that is formed. Their original, they were doing primarily what do you call singing in praise of the king, but they themselves become king in Magadha. And Anga is similarly the kingdom of Sutas. All the Sutas.
In fact, Sutas have a lot of kingdom. The Mahabharata describes many kingdoms where the kings were Sutas.
Yeah. So primarily, Anga Desha is actually meant for the Suta rulers. And this is another thing I have questioned all the leftist liberals who consider Duryodhana as a liberal. So Bhima said, like Bhima was straightforward. He's innocent and straightforward. He has questioned the Karna. How can you fight with Arjun? You're a Suta. That is straightforward. What Duryodhana is a very shrewd man. He said, no, I'm very. He's just pretending to be very liberal and say that I'm appointing Karna as a king of Anga. Basically, he's saying he is Suta.
Yeah.
Basically, Duryodhana is just saying the same thing like what Bhima has said. But he is
on the contrary. On the contrary, Madra Desha being of a different culture, and Nakula Sahadeva being children of from a Madra relationship.
Yes.
In the Pandava segment, there is hardly a differentiation between them and
so the
others.
Pandavas, correct, exactly. Like Yudhishthira means he has a very clear understanding about it. When somebody like I think Nahusha asked who is a Brahmana, he said that anybody who is having the knowledge of Brahman, he is Brahman. So he is very straightforward in that. So it is not based on birth. It is basically based on your qualities. Guna karmas, and again Yudhishthira is very close to Krishna's the Varna that definition. Chaturvarnya Maya system Gunakarma Vibhagasha, like that. That is based on Guna and Karma, like that he is mentioned. And Yudhishthira is also like before the Bhagavad Gita passage comes in the Bhishma Parva, you get the same passage in Vana Parva where there is a conversation between Nahusha in the form of a Naga conversing with the Yudhishthira. Naga, Nahusha, Yudhishthira conversation. So basically, Yaksha Prashna is more famous, but this is not so famous.
That's a beautiful conversation.
Yeah, so this conversation is also highly philosophical in nature and explains the kind of it's basically an interview of Yudhishthira.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's almost like Nahusha is imparting knowledge to Yudhishthira. It's that beautiful.
So he is basically a liberal. If you use the correct words, like Yudhishthira is a liberal in that sense. Whereas this again, I think I diverted to the eastern side. But Bahlika side, this is the kind of cultural differences. One of them is the Varna Vyavastha, there is a high flexibility. So Karna is accusing. One person is born as a Brahmin and then next day he is a Kshatriya. Next day he becomes Vaishya and then third day, fourth day he becomes Shudra. Again he becomes Brahmin. So he is because he is completely inducted into the Kuru orthodoxy.
Leftists think that Karna is wrong. So ironical that
Yes. Can I pause one because I think I not switched on the charge, so I'll just
please do.
Just pause sometime.
Yeah, please.
I think. Oh, okay, now it's yeah. So one is that liberal in the terms of Varna. Second is that marriage customs that you rightly pointed out. For marrying Madri, Bhishma has to pay Shalya the Tanya Shulka. That is given.
Yeah, here there are two interesting points. First is Bhishma knows the cultural difference, but he goes to Madri for some good reason. Right. Second, when the difference occurs, he honorably respects and comes back and goes back. So I think there is something that Bhishma sees that he wants to cross that line.
Yeah, actually, the one reason why the people like kings are interested in marrying from Madhya Desha is because this Western, that is, I always go with the align with the Talagiri's
correct.
So this particular the Western kingdoms, they are actually like for example in the Indo-European culture, if you look at it, they are slowly turning into Europeans. Whoever is migrating to the West. So culturally, they look more like Europeans. And if you go further west, all this Cambodia is also one of the Bahlika kingdom. So Matra, Kekeya, Gandhara, Cambodia, 4 kingdoms are mentioned as Bahlikas. So the Cambojas and the Kuru, it is all the Iranian kings like Xerxes and Cyrus. They are all descendant of Cambojas and Kurus. Cyrus means Kuru, and one of his forefather is Cambyses and Cambodia. So they use the surnames Cambodia and Kuru and interchangeability.
This is very consistent with what Shrikant Talagiri has written. It's a most fascinating account. Correct, people should read it actually.
And finally, once so that when they reach the Iran, they already have the Indo-European traits. And finally, the same group of people goes to the European, and you get all the European kind of diversified into the countries in Europe. And so maybe like our Indian, the Bharatiya kings consider it's a kind of controversial. They consider this Gandhara and Mathura princesses very beautiful because of white skin probably. So that is why there is interest in marrying from there. Like if you look at Ramayana, it will be very clear. Why is Dasharatha so much interested in Kaikeyi? The relationship is not similar to other wives like Kausalya or Sumitra. Kausalya is basically a Kausala native, and Sumitra is from Kashi. That is what is learned. But Kaikeyi has got special treatment. She is from KK Desha, and we understand Dasharatha was completely addicted to the beauty of Kaikeyi, and that is why this all this he become he could not become he just deviated from dharma. Similarly, in Mahabharata, very small passages are there how Pandu was a little bit infatuated with Madri. You can see like when in Vanvas it is mentioned like that. But this Kekeya, Gandhara, and they people also exploit the princess of Kuru or Kosala princess. All the kings, they exploit by trying to see their intelligence. Instead of the intelligence, they just project their beauty and trying to control the politics. So that is happened. That is happened.
That's an interpretation. I think guys like me who read it very metaphorically, we will have a different view in the whole thing. Yeah, so, yes. but it's interesting that there is so much of detail on the life that is described in those regions.
Yeah, right.
Since we are on the West, I now will. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, what I mean is that if you look at all these kingdoms currently in Pakistan, has tried to control Hastinapura or Ayodhya. That's what I'm saying in a single line. I'm saying, right? Shakuni Gandhari was fortunately a straightforward lady, but her brother Shakuni was completely trying to control the politics of Hastinapur. And in Ramayana, the Ayodhya, that was the seat of power at that time. Instead of Hastinapur was just a small town there. But Ayodhya was very powerful at that time. That was the Kaikeyi was trying to control that. And if not Kaikeyi, but then her Dasi, Manthara. Basically, they have a control kind of an attitude. And right now, look at now.
Yeah, so in hindsight, it looks like that, Judith, but in a metaphoric account,
correct.
We will have to limit the amount of civilizational conclusions that we will.
Yeah, I'm not actually. It's only a coincidence, I would say. I will not project it like just to say that all the because we need to reclaim them back. The Pakistanis are bad. No, I don't not say them. Maybe in future, and maybe today it looks very unreasonable and pipe dream. But within some 20-30 years, we need to reclaim the entire that brothers who are in the other side of the border and to our culture. Because there is no culture in the whatever currently they are following. There is no culture in that. Yeah.
At the minimum, they need to know their past very well.
Yes.
That itself should be the first good step.
Yeah, right.
Since we are on the West, I will come to one of the most important things that at least in the Indic civilizational circle, everybody knows, but the larger country does not know yet. And that is the research on the river Saraswati, which matches the description of the description of Saraswati in Balarama Tirtha Yatra. And Shalya Parva's Balarama Tirtha Yatra, for some reason, it contains so many, it's a long passage, Balarama explains. And I'm forever thankful to Vyasa for, putting that chapter, because now it is conclusively proven that the Paleo channel which is unearthed through ISRO studies and the satellite images perfectly matches with what Balarama explains. And Saraswati is no more a mythical river. It's a real river. And it also pushes the date of the entire civilization to beyond 1500 BC, older than that, because Saraswati died in the year by 1800. So at the minimum, Vedic civilization goes before 1800 BC.
Yeah. I think you're nudging me into the chronology part of it. The thing is, I have one of the things is that primarily I would say is the researchers who are actually studying Saraswati, mostly they look into the Rigveda. But Rigveda is not the largest narrative about Saraswati. And I was continuously always say to every researcher that if you want to know Saraswati, you have to go into Mahabharata, where it around more than the 18 chapters of Bhagavad Gita, 3 times that, I think 36 or more chapters are dedicated to Saraswati River.
Saraswati.
You don't, so this is the largest narrative of Saraswati is in Mahabharata. And in that narrative, very clearly it shows that the southern part of Saraswati was flowing, somehow still flowing. Northern part was flowing. In the middle, it was dried up, and that very clearly with so much. See, 36 or more chapters. I think 42. I will not exactly remember, but that many number of chapters means huge information you are getting, including what are the plants growing in each of the part of the Saraswati. Absolutely. Where it has dried up, like it is mentioning Vinashana, it has dried up, and it's again reappearing at Chamasodbheda. Yeah. So that is basically the word means that Udbheda means the ground is split and water is coming out. So basically it is a spring. So what happens is that Saraswati got dried up in Vinashana. So since I cannot show map right now, it may be not correct, right? I need to search and it's a little long, but maybe if I map is very clear, but I'll say somewhere in the north of Rajasthan, Vinashana, that Saraswati dried up, and then the Panyo, the channels were shown as a dried channel, and Balarama is clearly passing through the dried channel and using it as a road. So very clearly you can actually understand from that narrative. So 2 things here. The largest information about Saraswati is in Mahabharata. Is Balarama Tirtha Yatra is like around 42 chapters. So any researcher of Saraswati has to look at that. Second is, since you mentioned about chronology, I'm saying that it shows that Mahabharata, that events happened after the dry up of the Saraswati, partial dry up of Saraswati. The only difference between current Saraswati versus Balarama noticed Saraswati is that the river had a southern resurgence, like somewhere close to the flow like merging with the sea, it is reappearing and it start like flowing. At least some 100 kilometers it was flowing in the Sindh, in the current day Sindh, it was flowing, and this is not currently available. So that is the only difference. But the middle part dry up is there right time when Balarama was living. So what it means is that like chronologically, if you look at, then if you try to connect the Mahabharata dating with this particular information, so middle part dried up kind of a situation, then the dates, the best dates are actually somewhere between the 1500 BC to 2000 BC is the best date, because the dry up started somewhere around 1800 BC. And
but don't you think that the current research says that the dry up was almost complete by 1800 BC?
No, dry up means because see, again there is a kind of the word dry up is actually not an exact statement, right? So one is that when you say dry up, see, even today also Saraswati is not dried up, because it has got a flow in Haryana. So when you say dry up, it is a kind of a relative term, how much you consider it as a dried up. So that is one reason I support any Kurukshetra war date from 3200 BC to 1100 BC. I am giving my support because actually in the chronology debate I am actually put as a mediator. So I look at different dates of different researchers, like starting with Narahari Achar and then Manish Pandit, Vedavir Arya, and then Ashok Bhatnagar, and then Ramamurthy, and then the Dieter Koch date is somewhere around 1100 BC. It's a lower date. And the B.B. Lal, Professor B.B. Lal, who has unearthed because we need to give much weightage to him, he has unearthed all the historical site related to Mahabharata and Ramayana, like this Hastinapur. He and his team, like Hastinapur, and then Sringavarpur, Ayodhya, then Chitrakoot, and Kaushambi. These all are like excavated by B.B. Lal. And his own team members like K.N. Dikshit, he has unearthed Hichatra, Kampilya, then Indraprastha and Hastinapur, all these other places also unearthed. So he and his team has given a solid archaeological backing for our Itihasas and ensured that it is no longer discussed as a mythology. So that is the kind of contribution he is providing, and he has written a book where he has given his own reasons why he considered the Kurukshetra war occurred in 1824 BC. Sorry, 824 BC. It's a very low date, but he is like based on the like river, the Ganga river flowed over, or the flooded the Hastinapur, and the king, that is Nichakshu, has moved the capital from Hastinapur to Kaushambi, and he was able to see the archaeological records, which shows that the entire the built up the archaeology is just till around 850 BC it was developing. Suddenly it stopped, and then again this construction started at Kaushambi. So that is why he is saying that 850 BC. But recently, what I understood from people close to him is that he is ready to change because of that date, because this particular continuity is very clear signature he has found it, but still because the painted graver culture which he was relying on, it is now extending to 1300 BC, etc. And second is it is
so that is actually the limitation of the archaeology evidence, because archaeology evidence always says that, you know, latest it is this, but there is always a farther date that is possible.
Yeah. I will come to that. I'll come to that. Actually, the thing is, see, typically the archaeoastronomers who basically come with Mahabharata date, primarily based on the literature analysis and corroborating the nakshatra, graha nakshatra positions with the planet computed. It's a computer software computed positions in the planetarium software. So they have because everything is pattern matching. So
that's
for example, this Bibilal is done is also pattern matching, because he has got information in the archaeology in the literature that Nichakshu changed the capital from Hastinapur to Kaushambi, and he got a pattern matching in the archaeology that the record stopped at 850 BC in Hastinapur. Record again started at the same time the building started getting constructed at Kaushambi. So he is corroborated. The same kind of pattern matching the archaeoastronomers are also doing. So which pattern matching you completely believe? So that is a question. Because one is the pattern matching in the earth, that is Dhara. Another one is happening in the sky. So I always say, maintain this. If you have a very solid kind of a Mahabharata date, Dyaus and Dhara should match. They should be agreeing more or less. They are the two eternal witnesses of all events happened in earth. We say Agni is a Sakshi. Agni is a Sakshi. Similarly, Dyaus, that is the sky, is a witness to all the events happened in the earth, and earth itself is a witness to all the events. So in case of Mahabharata dating, Dyaus and Dhara has to match. So the kind
currently Dyaus is leading the show.
Now Dyaus is leading the show, and there is a mistrust because actually since I'm in this community with almost equal number of archaeologists and archaeoastronomers are my friend. So I'm always in between these discussions, and I have to I always try to say that because there is a mistrust. So the archaeoastronomers say that I cannot trust the archaeology, and archaeologists say that I cannot trust the archaeoastronomers, because the thing is there's archaeology. They require the actual records. And from a point of view, so many people say that, okay, from our karmic side, we are not so materialistic. So why to look at the material evidence? This is your belief, and it goes for a Shraddha and Bhakti and faith-based kind of point of view, it will accept. But if you want to get the acceptance in the broader scientific community, when you say there is a date 556 and 5561 BC Mahabharata war occurred, you have nothing to show at that time, no chariots is there excavated at that time, or even the question about the Sanskrit language at 5561 BC is doubtful. and so many like the number of years, like the Puranic kings. If you look at the Puranas, they will also talk about Magadha kings, like well-known Magadha kings, which is historically dated kings like Mahapadmananda is also mentioned in the Puranas. So Mahapadmananda's contemporary is Kshemaka. Kshemaka is a 30th descendant of Yudhishthira. So you have connections actually. So if your Mahabharata date doesn't support or if it destroys all this connection, then it's of no use. And that is what I would say. Second is I am archaeoastronomy. I am not as I said, exactly as I said, I have equal support to archaeology and archaeoastronomy. So I am not against archaeoastronomy, but I have certainly the archaeoastronomical dates which doesn't make big sense because it's too far-fetched, too far into the past. That I will not be able to accept it. As a person who has worked in ISRO for 5 years, I cannot accept that kind of a shallow kind of a scholarship because you need to have something. So fortunately, even in archaeoastronomy, there are dates which agree with archaeology. That's what I'm saying. There is one said, Bibilal is saying that this whatever 850 date, 835, 850 date, BC date he has mentioned about Mahabharata, based on that correlation, can also maybe recorrelated to something like 1500 BC or 2000 BC. That is possible.
Yeah, that's true. So that's possible. But that's why Saraswati is important, because now Saraswati has anchored the date somewhere at least minimum between 1500 to 2000 BC, and it can be beyond that also, because exactly to say when the river dried up is very, very difficult. When the river was half alive is very difficult to say. So for me, that Saraswati, for me, two things are important. One is Saraswati. Second is the unimpeachable astronomical evidences in Mahabharata, like in Shalyaparva. It says, Balrama says, it was 42 days and I went in this month and came back in the other month, where the interpretation is, it's not prone to interpretation, where it is explicitly mentioned. I think we need to extract explicitly mentioned references in Mahabharata and limit the interpretations to date analysis only to the explicit mentions.
Correct. I will, because being an insider of all this chronology analysis, I can tell you maybe it is not be highly visible to everybody. I will say every Mahabharata date which has come from archaeoastronomy, they cannot match every reference in Mahabharata. See, I think what you have mentioned is I have in one of my talk I have explained the entire process of chronology analysis. So it starts like this. First of all, you see there are 100,000 verses in Mahabharata. Currently, it is around 84,000 is critical edition. You can see 84,000 verses. Out of which the first step is you select all the candidate verses in Mahabharata which have something to do with the chronology. That is the first step. So filtering out the verses, maybe like Arundhati Vasishta, the verse describing Arundhati Vasishta, and there is a verse describing the position of Vishaka Nakshatra. There are verses describing the position of Guru Brihaspati with respect to various nakshatras. So the positions of planets with respect to nakshatras, they're all candidate. They select all of them. So you will get some around some 200 to 300 verses, which actually can be used for chronological analysis, which is either talking about some nakshatra or some comet or some graha at this point, that point, etc. And all these nakshatra, because this is not narrated by Vyas or some other person, which at a particular time in the Mahabharata events. For example, when the start of the Kurukshetra war, then what are the positions of nakshatras? What are the positions of grahas with respect to nakshatras? Or when Krishna started peace mission, what are the positions? So everything is mentioned. And then you start to try to corroborate it. So the total number of days between the events also is actually calculatable. So the total number of days between Kurukshetra, start of Kurukshetra war and Bhishma Nirvana. Then how many days elapsed between Krishna's peace mission and the start of the war? And there are two eclipses mentioned in Mahabharata. What are the dates? What is how much days are elapsed between? 13 days is what text mentioned, but 13 days is mathematically not possible actually. So it is like a fraction, like 13.5, 13.7, like that. So this is what. So there is not a single researcher who has matched everything 100%. Somewhere they make an assumption, somewhere they make an excuse. So, for example, Nilesh Hawk, the entire the Balrama's pilgrimage is not properly corroborated. You can like there was a discussion between Oak and Manish Pandit. You can go through that discussion. So that entire area is rejected. I mean, not proper attention is given to it. So similarly, different researchers they will pick up whichever is brighter for them. For their
but I'm quite
like
fascinated with Dr. Pandit's research.
Yeah, yes.
Where the astronomical references referred are, kind of more realistic.
Yes. Yeah.
To me, what is also interesting is it matches with the, Ravi Kirti's inscription of Pulikeshi era.
Right.
Where that shloka clearly, gives a date which matches with, Dr. Pandit's reference. But of course, you have a different opinion on that.
Yeah. See, I have supporting the dates, as I said, 3200 BC to 1100 BC, 110. They're all candidates for Mahabharata. So Bibilal's date, I have full respect for this, but 850 is actually out of the habitable zone because of one reason. By the time 850 BC, the entire warfare shifted from chariot-based to horseback-based. So 1000 BC onwards, now you cannot win any war on chariots. People will easily destroy your chariot. So the chariot was dominant somewhere around 1500 BC to 2000 BC. If you have a very good chariot, you can win the war. That kind of situation existed between 2000 to 1500 BC. I am talking from technology point of view because basically from that technology background. So this is very clear to me, like how the chariot now, how can you make a lightweight chariot? How much the spoked wheel chariot can, how much it actually give an advantage, a competitive advantage to you. All these things are very clearly any technology, any engineer can actually go and find out. So there is no debate in this area. So that is, I am very happy that Bibilal has maybe upgraded his date from 850 to somewhere in the range of 1000 to 2000 BC. He has not there was no conference where he can speak and actually, because he was a little bit ill health now. So not yet publicly announced it, but that is what I understood. What it means that you have between 1000 BC to 2000 BC, there is a the whatever that the most sought out agreement between Dyaus and Dhara. Dhara is agreeing, Dyaus is agreeing between 1000 to 2000 BC. But we consider because of the nature of archaeology, we consider a kind of extension up to 3200 BC, because archaeology can unearth anything in the ground and bring up some more sites. So that is why we are giving a kind of a buffer of 1200 years more, saying that 3200 BC to 1000 BC, any date can be a good candidate for Mahabharata date. That is what current 2020 we can tell. And I am saying it as a scientist because there is no absolute truth like scientists will tell. It's all subject to what is the evidence coming in if 2020, this is what I can say.
Yeah. That's true. So I think as in the next 10 years, the study of astronomical evidence so in Mahabharata will significantly improve and the discipline will evolve. The discipline is only now people are beginning to read because although in the colonial era, Scottish mathematicians have seen in Veda's descriptions, astronomical descriptions that are far deep into 2000 and they've questioned the dates of 1500 BC and all that. But somehow in the last 100 years, that has been sidelined. And the astronomy evidence in Mahabharata, I think that is important for the viewers, that Mahabharata is not just full of kingdoms and descriptions and so on and so forth life, but the sky, like you said, Dhara and life on Dhara, how much it is described. the Dyav is equally described in Mahabharata.
Yes,
And,
yes.
we will begin to understand that more and more. I think, Jijit, we're past our time.
Okay.
So this is a beautiful conversation. Mahabharata will never end. For me, Mahabharata is like my breath. I think in terms of Mahabharata, and we will definitely have an opportunity to discuss these things a lot more. One of these days. In fact, in my notes that I made out, there are so many points that I noted down from your research, which I could not even touch.
Okay.
And we will have, in fact, discussions on the Aila, Puru, and the Bharata
Bharata Kuru.
lineages.
Mhm.
You have a totally different view from the metaphoric accounts that we have,
Mhm.
and that
Mhm.
would have been a fascinating thing. Some other time, we should discuss that, and your interpretations of who Bhishma was, and
Mhm.
that's they're fascinating to me, because I'm fundamentally a metaphor guy, and will not try to look at it from whether it is a realistically possible kind of
Mhm.
analysis. And
Mhm.
but they're very, very interesting, and these directions of studies are also extremely important, because end of the day it is civilizational philosophy and civilizational history. Both are
Mhm.
together in Mahabharata.
Yeah, yes. So one way of actually, I'm currently into the creating schools textbooks and that kind of discussions. I have a lot of going on. So
Very good.
I am saying that, see, Mahabharata is about all the subjects that your child is going to learn, because it is geography, it is history, it is philosophy, it is literature, and
Absolutely.
mathematics also there in that.
Great.
Astronomy is there, chemistry is there inside that, and then very rare kind of traditional subjects like Swadhyaya, and all our, it's a basis of our tradition, entire tradition. And one important remark I have mentioned is that if your entire your entire civilization wiped out, or if you want to create a Bharatiya civilization Mars, in planet Mars, because I am into that area also, you can go take Mahabharata with you. If you are colonizing another planet, or even our entire Earth got completely wiped out after 1,000 years, you are again restarting the civilization. If you have Mahabharata, you can recreate Bharata Varsha with
It's a
even
beautiful metaphor. It's a
yeah,
beautiful way of
yeah,
describing the importance of
yeah,
Mahabharata for
yeah,
our society.
yes,
Absolutely. So, Jijit, I think I've read your work, I've watched your videos, but yet again to indulge in this conversation was a great experience. And I think we will have, as I said, we should have a lot more opportunity to talk to each other. I look forward to that. And as one of the Indian civilization enthusiast, I thank you for the kind of research that you have done. I hope that this kind of influences and inspires the next generation to undertake such studies in future. And I'm sure this conversation also contains enough clues for the enthusiasts to take forward this civilizational study. Thank you so much for being with me on this conversation, and wish you all the best in your Mahabharata voyage. I would like to say thank you. Namaste.
namaste.
Dhanyavad.
Thank you.